Eleanor had never seen the world, not even once. Born without sight, she had learned to navigate life using her other senses. What she lacked in vision, she made up for with her extraordinary hearing. She could tell who was walking down the hallway just by the sound of their footsteps. She could hear the slightest change in someone's voice that revealed their true feelings. And most importantly, she could hear music in ways that others couldn't, feeling every note deep in her soul. She was 28 when she met Richard at a charity fundraiser for the arts. Eleanor had been invited to speak about her experience with music therapy. She stood on stage, her white cane in hand, and talked about how music had been her window to the world. She spoke with such passion that the entire room fell silent, hanging on her every word. Richard was among those mesmerized listeners. He was 34, handsome in a sharp, conventional way that Eleanor would never see. What drew her to him was his voice, confident and smooth, with a laugh that seemed to bubble up from somewhere genuine. At least that's what she thought at the beginning. After her talk, he approached her. "Your speech moved me," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I've never thought about music that way before. Would you join me for dinner sometime?" Eleanor was surprised. Men rarely asked her out. Most were uncomfortable with her blindness, unsure of how to act around her. But Richard seemed different. He didn't speak louder as if she were deaf. He didn't grab her arm without permission. He asked first, then offered his elbow when she accepted. Their first date was at a small restaurant with a piano in the corner. Richard had arranged for the pianist to play Eleanor's favorite composers. "How did you know I love Debussy?" she asked, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "I did my research," he replied, and she felt his hand gently cover hers on the table. I wanted tonight to be perfect. It was the beginning of a whirlwind romance. Richard called her every day. He sent flowers to her apartment with notes written in Braille. He took her to concerts and described everything around them in vivid detail. When he proposed 6 months later with a ring that had tiny musical notes engraved around the band, something she could feel with her fingertips, Eleanor said yes, without hesitation. The wedding was grand, much bigger than Eleanor had wanted. "Only the best for my bride," Richard insisted when she suggested something smaller. 300 guests, most of them Richard's business associates and social connections, filled a historic church. Eleanor wore a dress that cost more than her yearly salary from teaching music at a school for children with disabilities. Richard spared no expense, and at the time she saw it as proof of his love. The first year of marriage was like a dream. They moved into Richard's mansion in the wealthy part of town. Eleanor had her own music room with a grand piano that Richard said was over 100 years old. It belonged to a famous composer, he told her proudly. "I had it shipped from Europe." Eleanor spent hours at that piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, creating melodies that expressed what words couldn't. Richard would listen from the doorway, applauding when she finished. "My talented wife," and he would say, "You're extraordinary." But something began to shift during their second year together. It started small, Richard coming home later and later, his voice tinged with stress. "Just business," he would say when she asked if everything was okay. "Nothing for you to worry about." Eleanor noticed he started drinking more at dinner. 1 glass of wine became 2, then 3. His laugh changed, becoming sharper, less genuine. And when he talked about her to others, she caught an edge in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Eleanor can't see, but she manages quite well," he would tell people, as if her blindness was something she had to overcome just to be acceptable. She tried to brush it off, telling herself he meant well. Then came the comments when they were alone. "The caterer put the wrong flowers on the table tonight," he said after one dinner party. "Not that you would know the difference." Eleanor felt the sting of his words but said nothing. She didn't want to fight. She told herself he was just tired, just stressed from work. Everyone had bad days, but the bad days became more frequent. Richard started criticizing how she dressed. "That color doesn't suit you," he would say, or "those earrings don't match your outfit." Eleanor had always chosen her clothes carefully, organizing her wardrobe with tactile markers and systems she had developed over years. She prided herself on her independence. Now Richard insisted on picking out her clothes for important events. "I just want you to look your best," he said when she objected. "People judge me by how my wife presents herself." Eleanor began to feel like a doll that Richard dressed up and showed off when it suited him, then put away when it didn't. At social gatherings, He would guide her around with a firm hand on her elbow, introducing her to people but then quickly steering conversations away from her. If someone showed too much interest in her music or her teaching, Richard would interrupt with talk of business or politics. By their third anniversary, Eleanor felt invisible in her own home. The music room that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage. She played less and less, feeling Richard's impatience whenever she sat at the piano. "Do you have to play right now?" he would ask. "I'm trying to work." One evening, they attended a party at the home of one of Richard's business partners. Eleanor wore the navy blue dress Richard had chosen, her hair styled the way he preferred. As they entered, she could hear the buzz of conversation, the clink of glasses, the sound of expensive shoes on marble floors. "Richard, good to see you," a booming voice called out. Footsteps approached, and Eleanor felt Richard's grip on her arm tighten. "Thomas, wonderful party," Richard replied, his public voice switching on. "Charming, confident, warm." "You know my wife, Eleanor?" "Of course." The musician. "Richard tells us you're quite talented." Eleanor smiled politely. "Thank you. I teach more than I perform these days." "Such a shame," Thomas said. "We'd love to hear you play sometime." Before Eleanor could respond, Richard cut in. "Eleanor's very modest about her abilities. Now tell me about that deal with the European investors." And just like that, she was pushed aside again. Throughout the evening, it happened over and over. Someone would speak to her, show interest in her life or her music, and Richard would redirect the conversation. Eleanor could hear the subtle message in his tone. "My wife's blindness makes her less important, less interesting, less worthy of your attention." Later that night, as their driver took them home, Eleanor finally spoke up. "You didn't have to cut me off every time someone spoke to me." The silence that followed felt heavy. Then Richard sighed, a sound full of exaggerated patience. "I was saving you from boring conversations, Eleanor. Those people don't really care about your music lessons for blind kids. They're just being polite." "They seemed genuinely interested," she said quietly. "Well, you can't see their faces, can you?" Richard replied, his voice cold. "Trust me, they were just feeling sorry for you." "For us?" Eleanor turned her face toward the window, feeling the cool glass against her cheek. "For us?" she echoed. "Yes, for us," Richard snapped. "Do you think it's easy being married to someone who needs help with everything? Who can't even see what she's wearing without someone telling her? Who stumbles around at parties, making everyone uncomfortable?" His words hit her like physical blows. Eleanor sat perfectly still, tears sliding down her cheeks. She had never felt her blindness as a burden until Richard made it one. When they got home, Eleanor went straight to the music room. She sat at the piano but didn't play. Instead, she ran her fingers over the keys, feeling their smooth coolness under her touch. The piano had been her friend since childhood, a constant companion that never judged, never belittled, never made her feel less than whole. She thought about the girl she had been before Richard, confident, independent, proud of her achievements. She thought about the woman she had become, shrinking herself to fit into the narrow space he allowed her, doubting abilities she had once trusted completely. As Eleanor sat in the dark room that night, something shifted inside her. A small spark of defiance ignited. Richard might control many things in their life together, but he couldn't control the music that lived inside her. No one could take that away. She didn't know then what challenges lay ahead or how Richard would try to use her blindness to humiliate her in the cruelest way. She didn't know that a piano would become both the weapon he chose against her and the unexpected instrument of her liberation. All she knew, as she finally began to play softly in the darkness, was that she needed to find her way back to herself before it was too late. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor knew it was important by the way Richard's footsteps quickened across the marble floor when he collected the mail. The sharp sound of paper tearing was followed by his satisfied exhale. "Perfect," he said, not to Eleanor but to himself. She was sitting in the corner of the living room, her fingers running over a book of poetry in Braille. But she might as well have been invisible. "What's perfect?" she asked, closing her book. Richard seemed surprised to hear her voice. "Oh, you're there. It's an invitation from the Wilsons. Gregory Wilson, the investor I've been trying to impress for months. He's finally agreed to bring his team to our home for dinner." Eleanor nodded. The name was familiar from Richard's phone calls and late-night complaints. Gregory Wilson controlled a massive investment fund, that could pour millions into Richard's development projects. For the past year, all Richard talked about was getting Wilson's attention. "When is the dinner?" Eleanor asked, already mentally preparing for what this would mean. Another night of being paraded around like a curiosity. Another evening of tight smiles and careful words. 2 weeks from Saturday, Richard replied, his voice shifting into what Eleanor had come to think of as his planning tone. Excited but controlled. "It needs to be perfect. I'm thinking we'll use the formal dining room. Bring in that chef from the French restaurant Wilson likes and have the string quartet playing during cocktails." "Sounds lovely," Eleanor said quietly. "Would you like me to help with anything?" Richard paused, and she could almost hear him considering whether she could be trusted with any meaningful task. "You can help by making sure you're properly dressed and ready on time," he finally said. "I'll handle everything else." In the days that followed, their home transformed into a stage set for Richard's performance. Workers came and went, cleaning staff polishing every surface, florists discussing arrangements, caterers planning elaborate menus. Eleanor moved through it all like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged. One afternoon, she overheard Richard on the phone with the interior designer. No, we need to move that piano out of the living room. It takes up too much space and we won't be using it. Put it in the back room for now." Eleanor froze. The piano in the living room was her favorite, a smaller instrument than the grand piano in the music room, but with a warmer sound that filled the space perfectly. She often played it in the afternoons, letting the sunlight warm her face through the windows as her fingers created melodies. "Richard," she said when he hung up, "please don't move the piano. I play it almost every day." "This isn't about you, Eleanor," he replied, irritation edging his voice. "This is business. The most important dinner of my career. We need the space for people to mingle." "But no buts," he cut her off. "The piano goes. You can still use the one in the music room if you need to play so badly." Eleanor pressed her lips together to stop herself from arguing further. The music room was at the back of the house, isolated and cold. Richard knew she preferred the living room piano, but as with so many things lately, her preferences didn't matter. The night before the dinner, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to Richard's deep breathing beside her, and wondered how they had reached this point. When had his ambition become more important than their connection? When had she become an afterthought in her own marriage? She slipped out of bed without waking him and made her way through the quiet house, her fingers trailing along the walls, counting doorways until she reached the back room where her piano had been exiled. She sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. "I miss you," she whispered to the instrument, as if it were an old friend. The day of the dinner arrived with a flurry of activity. Staff moved through the house like a well-choreographed dance, setting up, arranging, perfecting. Eleanor stayed in their bedroom most of the day, keeping out of the way as Richard had suggested. At 5 o'clock, her husband appeared at the bedroom door. "Time to get ready," he announced. "I've laid out your dress on the chair." "The navy blue one with the high neckline." Eleanor nodded. Though she had hoped to wear the burgundy dress she'd recently purchased, a rare shopping trip with her friend Valerie, who had helped her select something that made her feel beautiful. But Richard preferred the navy dress because it was appropriate and didn't call attention to itself. Like me, Eleanor thought bitterly. She took extra care with her appearance, knowing Richard would inspect her before allowing her to join the party. She applied her makeup using the techniques she'd practiced for years, fingers moving carefully over her face. She styled her hair simply but elegantly, and put on the pearl earrings Richard had given her on their first anniversary, back when his gifts still felt like expressions of love rather than payments for her compliance. When she was ready, she called for Richard. His footsteps approached, stopped, and she felt his critical gaze moving over her. "You'll do," he said after a moment. "Remember, these people are important. Be charming but not too talkative. Don't bring up your teaching unless someone asks directly. And for God's sake, don't mention your blindness unless it's absolutely necessary. I don't want their pity." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the hurt his words caused. "I understand." The guests began to arrive at 7. Eleanor stood beside Richard in the foyer, greeting each person with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She had learned to perfect this performance, the gracious wife who didn't need to see to know exactly how to behave. "Gregory, welcome." Richard's voice changed entirely when the guest of honor arrived, becoming almost boyishly eager. "This is my wife, Eleanor." "Lovely to meet you, Mrs. Hampton," a deep voice replied as a large hand engulfed Eleanor's in a handshake. "Richard speaks very highly of you." Eleanor doubted that was true but smiled warmly. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Wilson. Welcome to our home." As they moved to the living room for pre-dinner cocktails, Eleanor could hear the string quartet playing softly in the corner. The room smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfume, with the underlying scent of the aged whiskey Richard had imported specifically for tonight. "Your home is magnificent," a woman's voice said nearby. "Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor assumed. "I'm especially drawn to that beautiful back room we passed." "Was that a piano I saw in there?" "Yes," Richard replied smoothly. "My wife occasionally plays." "Oh, how wonderful," Mrs. Wilson exclaimed. "Do you perform, Mrs. Hampton?" Before Eleanor could answer, Richard jumped in. No, just a hobby. Nothing worth mentioning." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. There had been a time when she did perform, when she'd been invited to play at charity events and small recitals. Before Richard convinced her that it wasn't suitable for a woman of her position. Dinner proceeded exactly as Richard had planned. The food was exquisite, the wine perfectly paired, the conversation carefully steered toward topics that showcased Richard's knowledge and business acumen. Eleanor sat quietly, speaking only when directly addressed, becoming the invisible wife Richard preferred in these settings. As dessert was being served, Gregory Wilson turned his attention to Eleanor. "Richard tells me you teach music, Mrs. Hampton. That must be rewarding work." Eleanor felt Richard tense beside her but smiled at Mr. Wilson. "It is." "I work with children who, just part-time," Richard interrupted. "More of a volunteer position, really. Eleanor has so many charitable interests." Eleanor gripped her dessert fork tightly. Another lie. Her teaching was professional and something she took immense pride in. The school paid her well for her expertise and her students showed remarkable progress under her guidance. But Richard had always diminished her career, treating it as a cute hobby rather than meaningful work. "I'd love to hear more about it," Mrs. Wilson said kindly, clearly noticing the interruption. "Do you teach piano primarily?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, deciding to ignore Richard's warning signals. "I specialize in working with visually impaired children, teaching them to connect with music in ways that don't rely on reading traditional sheet music." "That's fascinating," Mrs. Wilson said genuinely. "And do you play yourself?" The table went quiet, as if everyone sensed the tension suddenly radiating from Richard. Eleanor could feel his leg pressed against hers under the table, his foot tapping a warning. "I do," she said simply. "Oh, you must play for us after dinner," Mrs. Wilson exclaimed. "Wouldn't that be lovely, Gregory?" "Indeed it would," Mr. Wilson agreed. "I'm a great lover of piano music." Eleanor felt Richard's hand clamp down on her knee under the table, his fingers digging in painfully. "I'm afraid that's not possible tonight," he said with a false laugh. "Eleanor hasn't practiced in ages and the piano hasn't been tuned recently." "Nonsense," Gregory Wilson said good-naturedly. "I'm sure Mrs. Hampton plays beautifully, and I've never met a pianist who doesn't practice regularly." Eleanor could feel the trap closing around her. If she refused, she would appear rude to their important guests. If she played poorly, she would embarrass Richard. And if she played well, she wasn't entirely sure what Richard feared more. "Perhaps just one piece," Mrs. Wilson pressed. "After coffee?" Richard's fingers tightened once more on Eleanor's knee, then released. She could almost hear the calculations running through his head, weighing the social consequences of refusal against the risk of her performance. "Of course," he finally said, his voice tight with forced graciousness. "Eleanor would be delighted to play for you after coffee. Nothing too elaborate, but a small demonstration." As the dinner party moved from the dining room to the living room for coffee and liqueurs, Eleanor felt Richard grab her elbow and pull her slightly behind the others. "Don't embarrass me," he hissed in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Play something simple, something you can't mess up. And keep it short." Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. In that moment she realized that Richard truly believed she would fail, that he expected her to embarrass herself and by extension him. The thought sent a chill through her body, followed by something unexpected, a flicker of defiance. As the guests settled in the living room, Mrs. Wilson brought up the piano again. "I believe you promised us a performance, Mrs. Hampton." All eyes turned to Eleanor, and she felt Richard's hand at her back, guiding her toward the back room where the piano waited. His touch seemed gentle to anyone watching, but Eleanor could feel the tension in his fingers, the slight push that felt more like a shove. "Yes," she said, smiling in the direction of Mrs. Wilson's voice. "I'd be happy to play something for you all." The guests followed Eleanor and Richard to the back room where the piano had been exiled. Eleanor could sense their curiosity, not just about her playing, but about her blindness too. She was used to that curiosity, the unspoken questions that hung in the air around her. How does she do it? How will she find the keys? Will this be awkward to watch? The room felt crowded suddenly, filled with the rustle of expensive clothing and the subtle sense of perfume and aftershave. Eleanor counted 8 sets of footsteps besides her own and Richard's. The entire dinner party had come to watch. "Here we are," Richard announced, his voice overly bright. "Eleanor will play something brief for us." Eleanor felt him guide her to the piano bench, his hand pressing down firmly on her shoulder as she sat. He leaned close, pretending to adjust her position but actually whispering in her ear, "Keep it simple. Don't try to show off." His breath was warm against her skin, carrying the scent of the brandy he'd been drinking all evening. Eleanor nodded slightly, just enough to acknowledge she'd heard him. But inside, something was shifting, a resolve hardening into determination. For 3 years, she had been shrinking herself to fit into the box Richard had created for her. For 3 years, she had allowed him to dim her light, to make her feel less than she was. Tonight, with these strangers watching, she felt oddly free. What did she have to lose? "The piano hasn't been tuned recently," Richard said loudly to the guests, already making excuses for her. "And Eleanor hasn't had much time to practice lately, so please be understanding." More lies. The piano was perfectly tuned. Eleanor could tell by touching a single key, feeling the vibration that was exactly as it should be. And as for practice, Richard didn't know about the mornings when he left early for work, how she would slip into this very room and play for hours, her fingers rediscovering their strength and agility. "I'm sure it will be lovely," Mrs. Wilson said kindly from somewhere to Eleanor's right. "What will you play for us, dear?" Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the keys, not yet pressing down. She had planned to follow Richard's instructions, to play something simple and forgettable. Maybe a basic Mozart piece or a gentle Brahms lullaby. But sitting here, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips and the weight of Richard's expectations pressing down on her, she made a different choice. "Chopin," she said softly. "Nocturne in C-sharp minor." She heard Richard's sharp intake of breath. He knew what she was doing. The nocturne was not a simple piece. It was complex, emotional, technically demanding. It required not just skill but soul. It was a piece that, if played poorly, would be painfully obvious to anyone listening. But if played well, Chopin, an older man's voice said appreciatively. "Mr. Lawson, one of the investors." A challenging choice. Eleanor smiled slightly. "It's a piece I've always loved." Richard's hand suddenly gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. "Perhaps something less ambitious would be better," he suggested, his voice tight with controlled panic. "No, please, I'd love to hear the Chopin," Mrs. Wilson insisted. "It's one of my favorites as well." Richard's hand fell away from Eleanor's shoulder. She could almost hear his thoughts, calculating whether causing a scene by insisting she play. Something else would be more embarrassing than letting her attempt the difficult piece. "Very well," he said finally, his tone suggesting he was granting a generous concession. "The Chopin it is." Eleanor took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Not that it made any difference to her vision, but it helped her focus, to turn inward to the place where music lived inside her. The room around her faded away. The judgment, the expectations, even Richard's displeasure, all of it receded as she prepared to play. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. She could feel the guests watching her, their collective breath held. Richard had positioned himself somewhere behind her, probably ready to cut her performance short at the first mistake. She pushed all of that from her mind, and then she began to play. The opening notes filled the room, soft and tentative at first, like a question being asked. Eleanor's fingers moved with precision, born of thousands of hours of practice. Not just from her childhood lessons or her recent secret sessions, but from a lifetime of loving this instrument, of letting it speak for her when words failed. The piece built slowly, gathering emotion and complexity. Eleanor leaned into the music, her body swaying slightly as her fingers danced across the keys. She didn't need to see the piano. It was an extension of herself, as familiar as her own heartbeat. The nocturne was a piece of profound longing and quiet strength. As she played, Eleanor poured everything into it. Her frustration with Richard, her grief for the marriage she had thought they would have, her determination not to be diminished any longer. The music rose and fell, building to crescendos that made the air vibrate, then retreating to passages so delicate they seemed to float in the silence between notes. She was vaguely aware of the room around her growing completely still. Even the usual small sounds of a gathering, the shifting in seats, the clearing of throats, the clinking of glasses, had stopped. There was only her and the piano and the music flowing between them. As she approached the most technically challenging section of the piece, Eleanor felt a moment of doubt creep in. Richard's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't embarrass me." Her fingers hesitated for a split second, barely noticeable to anyone listening, but a lifetime to her. Then she thought of her students, the children who trusted her to show them that blindness was not a limitation, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. What would they think if they knew she was afraid to play her best because her husband wanted her to appear less talented than she was? The doubt vanished. Her fingers found their confidence again, moving through the difficult passages with fluid grace. The music soared, filling the room, touching something deep and true. When the final notes faded away, Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The silence that followed was absolute. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had misjudged everything, that her performance had been so poor that the guests were embarrassed for her, that Richard had been right all along. Then she heard it, the sound of someone sniffling, trying to hold back tears. A moment later, there was the rustle of movement and then the sound of hands coming together, one pair at first, then another, and suddenly the room erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. "Bravo," called Mr. Lawson, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely magnificent." "My dear," Mrs. Wilson said, and Eleanor could hear her moving closer. "That was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard. You play with such feeling." Eleanor felt a hand touch her shoulder. A gentle, respectful touch, nothing like Richard's controlling grip. "Thank you," she said softly, emotion making her voice tremble slightly. More praise followed, the guests crowding around the piano to express their admiration. Someone asked where she had studied. Another wanted to know if she had ever recorded her playing. A third mentioned a niece who was learning piano and wondered if Eleanor might consider taking on another student. Through it all, Richard remained silent. Eleanor couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence, a cold stillness amid the warm enthusiasm of the others. She knew without being told that he was furious, not just because she had disobeyed him, but because she had succeeded where he had expected, perhaps even wanted, her to fail. "I had no idea Richard was keeping such talent hidden away," Gregory Wilson said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Mrs. Hampton, you are a true artist." "Indeed," agreed his wife. "Richard, you must be so proud." There was an awkward pause, and Eleanor could almost feel everyone looking at Richard, waiting for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight but controlled. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Eleanor has always been talented. I've encouraged her playing from the beginning." The lie was so blatant that Eleanor nearly laughed out loud. Instead, she kept her face carefully neutral, her hands still resting on the piano keys. "How long have you been playing?" asked one of the other guests. "Since I was 5, Eleanor replied. "My parents noticed I had a good ear for music and found me a teacher who specialized in working with blind students." "And now you teach others," Mrs. Wilson said warmly. "How wonderful to pass on your gift." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, feeling a strange confidence growing inside her. "My students inspire me every day. They remind me that limitations only exist if we accept them." She heard Richard clear his throat, a warning signal she had learned to recognize. But for once she didn't heed it. "In fact," she continued, "I'm working with my school to develop a new program for children with various disabilities, not just visual impairments. Music can be such a powerful way to express yourself when other forms of communication are challenging. That sounds like important work, Gregory Wilson said, his tone thoughtful. My foundation has been looking to support more arts education initiatives. Perhaps we should talk further about this program of yours, Mrs. Hampton. Eleanor could practically hear Richard's mental calculations shifting. His wife, whom he had tried to minimize all evening, was suddenly of interest to the very investor he had been desperate to impress. What a wonderful idea, Richard said, his voice suddenly warm with enthusiasm. Eleanor would love to tell you more about her work, wouldn't you, darling? The endearment sounded false to Eleanor's ears, a performance for their guests rather than a genuine expression of affection. She smiled in the direction of Gregory Wilson's voice. I would be happy to, she said sincerely. The program means a great deal to me. As the conversation continued, Eleanor remained seated at the piano, occasionally running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. This instrument that Richard had tried to hide away, this talent he had tried to diminish, they had become her unexpected allies tonight. The evening was far from over, and Eleanor knew there would be consequences for her defiance once the guests departed. But something had changed irrevocably. She had found her voice again in the language she understood best, music, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced again. The rest of the evening unfolded like a strange dream for Eleanor. After her performance, everything changed. The air in the room, the tone of conversation, even how the guests addressed her. No longer was she just Richard's wife or the blind woman. She had become Eleanor the pianist, Eleanor the teacher, Eleanor the person with ideas worth hearing. Gregory Wilson insisted she join their discussion about his foundation's arts initiatives, pulling up a chair for her at the center of the group, rather than at the edges where Richard typically placed her. People asked her questions directly instead of looking to Richard to answer for her. When she spoke, they listened, not with the polite tolerance she was used to, but with genuine interest. Through it all, she could sense Richard's presence like a storm gathering strength. He maintained his charming host persona, laughing at the right moments, refilling drinks with practiced grace. But Eleanor, attuned to the subtleties of his moods after years of marriage, could hear the tension in his voice, the slightly too sharp edge to his laughter. Your wife is remarkable, Richard, Gregory Wilson said as the evening was winding down. Talented, passionate about her work, and clearly brilliant. You're a fortunate man. Indeed I am, Richard replied smoothly. I've always said Eleanor is special. The words were right, but the tone was wrong, too tight, too controlled. Eleanor knew that tone well. It was the same one he used when signing checks for household expenses he considered frivolous or when discussing family members he disliked, but had to acknowledge, as the guests gathered their coats and exchanged final pleasantries in the foyer. Mrs. Wilson approached Eleanor and took her hand. I meant what I said about your playing, she said warmly. It was truly extraordinary, and I'd love to hear more about your teaching program. Thank you, Eleanor replied, genuinely touched by the woman's kindness. That means a great deal to me. I have a card for you, Mrs. Wilson continued, pressing a small, stiff rectangle into Eleanor's palm. My personal number is on the back. I've written it in pencil and pressed hard so you can feel it. Please call me next week. I'm on the board of the City Arts Council and we should talk. Eleanor closed her fingers around the card, emotion welling in her throat. This simple act of consideration, writing a phone number in a way she could access independently, spoke volumes about Mrs. Wilson's character. How different from Richard, who had gradually taken over managing her contacts and appointments to make things easier, effectively isolating her from making independent connections. I will, Eleanor promised, slipping the card into her dress pocket before Richard could notice and intervene. The front door closed behind the last guest at 11:45. The house fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant sound of the staff cleaning up in the dining room, and Richard's breathing. Too controlled, too measured, like a predator waiting to strike. Well, he said finally, his voice deceptively light. That was quite an evening. Eleanor said nothing, waiting. Experience had taught her that Richard's anger was often preceded by this false calm. Gregory seemed impressed, Richard continued, and she heard him moving around the foyer, straightening things that didn't need straightening. The deal is as good as done. I'm glad, Eleanor said carefully. Yes, I thought you would be. His tone shifted, the pretense of pleasantness falling away. Especially since you made sure to put yourself at the center of everything. There it was, the first crack in the facade. Eleanor stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her. That wasn't my intention, she said quietly. Mrs. Wilson asked me to play and I— Don't lie to me, Richard cut her off, his voice low but sharp as a blade. You deliberately chose a piece you knew would draw attention. You ignored what I told you and made a spectacle of yourself. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I played a piece I love and know well. I didn't think that would upset you. Don't play innocent, Richard snapped, and she heard him moving closer, could feel the heat of his anger radiating from him. You knew exactly what you were doing. I told you to keep it simple, to stay in the background. But you couldn't stand not being the center of attention for once. The accusation was so backwards, so completely opposite to how their marriage actually functioned, that Eleanor almost laughed. She who had spent 3 years shrinking herself to avoid Richard's displeasure, being accused of attention-seeking? That's not fair, she said, finding her voice. I've never tried to overshadow you, Richard. If anything, I've made myself smaller to build you up. Is that what you think? His voice was dangerous now, soft but seething. That you've been doing me a favor? Let me tell you something, Eleanor. Do you know what people see when they look at us? They see a successful man who was noble enough to marry a blind woman. They see me carrying the burden of your disability every single day. They pity me. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Is that really how he saw their marriage? As a burden he carried? As something people pitied him for? I've never been a burden, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I've taken care of myself since long before I met you. I have a career, friends, a life that I built. I didn't need rescuing. Please, Richard scoffed. You lived in a tiny apartment. You took the bus. You counted pennies. Look at what I've given you. This house, financial security, a position in society. And look at what I've given up. Eleanor countered, surprising herself with her boldness. My independence. My confidence. My music. Your music? Richard laughed, a harsh sound without humor. What you did tonight wasn't music, it was manipulation. Using your so-called talent to curry favor with my business associates. Making them feel sorry for you. They didn't feel sorry for me, Eleanor said firmly. They appreciated my playing because it was good. Not because I'm blind, but because I'm skilled. There's a difference, Richard. She heard him moving again, pacing the foyer like a caged animal. You've gotten very bold suddenly, he said coldly. One little round of applause and you think you're special. I've always been special, Eleanor replied, the words coming from a place of truth she had almost forgotten existed within her. Just as you've always been talented at business. The difference is, I've never tried to make you feel less than you are. I've never asked you to pretend to be bad at what you do well. Richard was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, the anger submerged beneath a layer of calculated control. Gregory mentioned something about his foundation funding your school program, he said. That could be useful. I want you to call him tomorrow, set up a meeting. I'll come with you, of course. The sudden pivot made Eleanor's head spin. This was Richard's favorite tactic, shifting directions when confrontation didn't work, finding a way to reassert control. Mrs. Wilson gave me her card, Eleanor said cautiously. She's on the City Arts Council. She suggested I call her next week to discuss it further. Perfect, Richard said, as if their argument had never happened. I'll handle that call for you. We'll need to be strategic about how we approach this. The Wilson Foundation has considerable resources. And just like that, he was attempting to take over, to insert himself into this opportunity that had come directly to her. 6 months ago, Eleanor would have yielded, would have handed over Mrs. Wilson's card and let Richard manage everything. But something had changed tonight. I think I should make the call myself, she said firmly. Mrs. Wilson specifically asked me to contact her about my teaching program. Don't be silly, Richard replied dismissively. These kinds of negotiations are delicate. You're not experienced in dealing with foundation grants or funding proposals. Actually, I am, Eleanor countered. I've written 3 successful grant proposals for the school's music department in the past 2 years. The director asked me to take the lead because of my background in arts education. She hadn't told Richard about those grants. At first, it had been because he showed so little interest in her work. Later, It became a small piece of herself she kept private, protected from his criticism or dismissal. 3 grants? Richard sounded genuinely surprised. When did you do that? During those evenings when you were working late, Eleanor replied. I have a life too, Richard. Parts of it you don't even know about because you've never bothered to ask. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Eleanor could almost hear Richard reassessing her, recalculating his approach. Well, he finally said, his tone artificially light again, all the more reason for us to work together on this Wilson Foundation opportunity. With your experience and my business connections, we could secure significant funding. Eleanor shook her head, even though she knew Richard couldn't see the gesture in the dimly lit foyer. No, she said simply. This is my project, my program, my professional relationship with Mrs. Wilson. I appreciate your support, but I need to handle this myself. Richard moved closer, and she felt his hand close around her upper arm, not painfully tight, but firm enough to remind her of his physical presence, his strength. I'm trying to help you, Eleanor, he said, his voice low. Don't be stubborn about this. You need me. For 3 years, those words had worked. For 3 years, she had allowed Richard to convince her that she needed him more than he needed her, that her independence was a fantasy, that his control was for her own good. But tonight, surrounded by the lingering echoes of Chopin's Nocturne and the memory of genuine respect in the voices of their guests, Eleanor found a truth she had known before her marriage but had somehow lost along the way. She was whole on her own. No, Richard, she said quietly but firmly, gently removing his hand from her arm. I don't need you to manage this for me. What I need is for you to respect me enough to let me handle my own professional opportunities. His sharp intake of breath told her how unexpected her resistance was. Richard was used to her eventual compliance no matter how much she might initially object. This isn't like you, he said, and for the first time, she heard uncertainty in his voice. You're being unreasonable. No, Eleanor replied with a calm she didn't entirely feel. I'm being myself. The self I was before I started believing I was less capable than I am. She turned away from him and began walking toward the stairs, her hand trailing along the wall to guide her. The conversation wasn't over, not really. There would be more arguments, more attempts by Richard to regain control. But something fundamental had shifted tonight, and they both knew it. Where are you going? Richard called after her, sounding almost bewildered by this new version of his usually compliant wife. We're not finished discussing this. I'm going to bed, Eleanor replied without turning back. It's been a long evening, and I'm tired. We can talk more tomorrow if you'd like. She continued up the stairs, each step feeling like a small act of reclamation. Behind her, she heard Richard's frustrated sigh, followed by the sound of crystal clinking against glass. He was pouring himself another drink. Eleanor reached their bedroom and closed the door behind her. In the quiet darkness, she allowed herself a small smile. Tonight had been a beginning, not an end. The road ahead would be difficult, navigating a marriage that had become so unbalanced, finding her way back to the confident woman she had once been. But for the first time in years, she felt something like hope. Her fingers still tingled with the memory of the piano keys, with the power of creating something beautiful that was entirely her own. No one could take that away from her, not even Richard. The morning after the dinner party, Eleanor woke early. For a moment, she lay still, listening to Richard's deep, even breathing beside her. He had come to bed late, long after she had fallen asleep, smelling of expensive whiskey and frustration. She slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him and face another confrontation so soon. The house was silent as she made her way downstairs, her fingers trailing along the familiar walls, counting doorways and turns until she reached the kitchen. The staff wouldn't arrive for another hour. Eleanor enjoyed these rare moments of solitude in the large house, when she could move at her own pace without Richard's scrutiny or the well-meaning but watchful eyes of the household. Staff. She made herself a cup of tea and carried it carefully to the back room where her piano waited. Sitting on the bench, she set her tea on the small table beside her and ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down, remembering last night's performance and the unexpected turning point it had created in her life. Almost without conscious thought, she began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence. Not Chopin this time, but Bach, a piece that always centered her, its mathematical precision and clean lines bringing order to her. thought she was so absorbed in the music that she didn't hear Richard approach until he spoke from the doorway. "You're up early." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the keys. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." His voice sounded tired, drained of the anger from the night before. She heard him move into the room and felt the bench shift slightly as he sat beside her, keeping a careful distance between them. "We need to talk about last night." Eleanor nodded, waiting. In their 3 years of marriage, she had learned that when Richard said, "We need to talk," he usually meant he needed to talk while she listened. But this morning felt different, the air between them charged with something new and unsettled. "I've been thinking," Richard began, then paused. "What you said about not needing me to manage your professional opportunities. I didn't handle that well." The admission surprised Eleanor. Richard rarely acknowledged when he was wrong. "It caught me off guard," he continued. "I'm used to helping you. Controlling me," Eleanor corrected gently. Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Is that how you see it?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "And I think if you're honest with yourself, that's how you see it too." Another silence, longer this time. When Richard spoke again, his voice had an unfamiliar quality, uncertainty. "When we met, you were so independent. It was one of the things that attracted me to you. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking you needed me to make decisions for you. I told myself it was for your benefit, but maybe it was for mine." Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the piano keys, not playing, but drawing comfort from their familiar feel beneath her fingertips. "Why would you need that, Richard? You have so much control in every other aspect of your life, your business, your social standing. Why did you need to control me too?" She heard him shift on the bench, the soft sound of expensive fabric as he crossed and uncrossed his legs. "Because you're the one thing in my life I've been afraid of losing," he said finally, the words sounding as if they were being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "If I made you dependent on me, you wouldn't leave." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way their communications rarely were. Eleanor took a moment to absorb his words, to understand what he was really saying. "So instead of earning my love and trust," she said carefully, "you tried to make it impossible for me to live without you." "It sounds terrible when you put it that way," Richard said quietly. "Because it is terrible," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice gentle despite the hard truth of her words. "You didn't trust me to stay because I wanted to. You didn't trust yourself to be someone I would want to stay with." Richard was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if he had gotten up and left silently. Then she felt the bench shift as he stood. "I need some time to think," he said, his voice coming from above her now. "I have meetings in the city today. We can talk more tonight." Eleanor nodded, her fingers finding the piano keys again. "I'll be here." She heard his footsteps retreating, then pausing at the doorway. "Eleanor, yes? What you played last night? It was beautiful. I'm sorry I tried to stop you." Before she could respond, he was gone. Eleanor sat very still, absorbing what had just happened. In 3 years of marriage, that might have been their most honest conversation. Not a resolution, not by any means, but perhaps a beginning, a crack in the wall of control and resentment that had grown between them. She played for another hour, letting the music help her think, help her feel. Then she went upstairs to shower and dress for the day ahead. As she ran her fingers over the clothes in her closet, carefully organized by color and texture to make them easier for her to identify, she found herself choosing the burgundy dress, the one she had wanted to wear to the dinner party, the one Richard had rejected in favor of the appropriate navy blue. Dressed and feeling more like herself than she had in months, Eleanor found Mrs. Wilson's card in the pocket of her dress from the night before. Her fingers traced the pencil indentations on the back, feeling out the phone number. Before she could second-guess herself, she picked up the phone and dialed. Mrs. Wilson answered on the third ring, her voice warm with pleased surprise when Eleanor identified herself. "I was hoping you'd call," Mrs. Wilson said, "though I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the Arts Council," Eleanor replied. "I'd love to meet and discuss it further." "Wonderful. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? There's a lovely cafe near the concert hall that has excellent food and enough privacy for us to talk business." Eleanor agreed to the time and place, a feeling of purpose energizing her. After hanging up, she called for a car to take her to the school where she taught. She had a regular lesson scheduled that afternoon. but she wanted to arrive early to speak with the director about expanding her teaching program, the very program that had caught Mrs. Wilson's interest. The day passed in a blur of activity and possibility. Her students were delighted by her unusually buoyant mood, responding with enthusiasm to her lessons. The school director was intrigued by her ideas for expansion and promised to review her proposal. By the time Eleanor returned home in the late afternoon, she felt more alive than she had in years. The house was still empty when she arrived. Richard was still in the city at his meetings. Eleanor asked the housekeeper to let her know when he returned, then went to the living room and was surprised to discover the piano had been moved back from the back room. Its familiar presence filled her with quiet joy as she sat down to play. Hours later, as twilight settled over the house, she heard the front door open and Richard's footsteps in the hallway. They paused when he reached the living room doorway. "You moved the piano back," Eleanor said, her fingers still moving over the keys, playing a gentle Schubert piece. "Yes," Richard replied, his voice careful, measured. "It belongs here." Eleanor nodded but continued playing, giving him space to say whatever he had come to say. "I've been thinking all day," he began, moving into the room but not sitting down, "about what you said this morning, about control and trust." Eleanor's hand stilled on the piano. She turned her face toward his voice, waiting. "You were right," he said simply. "I tried to make you need me because I was afraid you wouldn't want me. And in doing that, I've been cruel to you in ways I didn't want to admit to myself." The admission hung in the air between them, weighty with implication. Eleanor heard him moving closer, felt the air shift as he sat in the armchair near the piano. "I spoke with my therapist today," he continued, surprising her. Richard had never mentioned seeing a therapist before. "I've been seeing him for a few months, though I told you I was at business meetings. I was too proud to admit I needed help. But today I talked about us, about how I've been treating you." "What did he say?" Eleanor asked softly. "He said I've been using your blindness as an excuse to control you because of my own insecurities. He said," Richard's voice caught, "he said I've been emotionally abusive and that you would be justified in leaving me." Eleanor's heart thumped painfully in her chest. To hear Richard acknowledge aloud what she had felt for so long but couldn't name was both validating and terrifying. "Are you going to leave?" he asked, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "I can't make that decision today. What I do know is that things can't continue as they have been. I won't let them." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "I want to do better, Eleanor. I want to be worthy of you. But I understand if it's too late." "I have lunch with Mrs. Wilson tomorrow," Eleanor said, changing the subject slightly. "We're going to discuss my teaching program and the possible funding from the Arts Council." "That's good," Richard replied, and she could hear him making an effort to be supportive rather than controlling. Would you like me to drive you there?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, thank you. I've arranged for a car." She paused, then added gently, "This is something I need to do on my own." "Of course." His voice was strained but accepting. "Eleanor, whatever you decide about us, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. What you did last night, your playing, it wasn't just beautiful, it was brave. Braver than I've ever been." The words touched something deep inside her, a place that had been wounded by his criticism and control, a place that had been starving for this simple acknowledgement of her strength. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. They sat in silence for a few moments, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts and uncertain futures. Then Eleanor's fingers returned to the piano keys, finding the opening notes of a piece she hadn't played in years, a piece from when they first met, when possibilities seemed endless and love felt uncomplicated. She didn't invite Richard to stay and listen, but he didn't leave either. As the music filled the room, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't and might never be. Not because she had decided to stay or go. That decision would require more time, more thought, more evidence of real change. No, the peace came from somewhere deeper, from the realization that whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. She had found her voice again, in the universal language she had always understood best. The music flowing from her fingertips told a story of pain and resilience, of shadows and light, of endings and new beginnings. And for the first time in years, Eleanor was the one telling her own story. No one else would write it for her again. As the final notes faded into silence, Eleanor felt the future open before her like a door to an unfamiliar room, frightening in its uncertainty, but hers to step through when she was ready. Richard remained quiet in his chair, listening not just to her music but perhaps, finally, to her. The rich husband who had once sought to embarrass his blind wife had instead been humbled by her talent and her courage. And the wife who had allowed herself to be diminished was standing tall again, her inner light rekindled by the very gift he had tried to suppress. Whatever tomorrow might bring. Tonight Eleanor played for herself, and that was enough.